Have you ever screamed, "Leave me alone," at someone you love just because you were feeling overwhelmed? We say things we don't mean in the heat of the moment. But what happens if that person actually listens and simply walks away? This is the story of Charlotte. She had the perfect life and a husband, William, who was dependable and kind. But to Charlotte, dependable felt like a trap. She wanted fire, she wanted passion, or at least, she thought she did. If you enjoy stories about complex relationships, regret, and the harsh reality of losing a good thing, please hit that subscribe button and stay with me. When Charlotte finally pushed William away, she expected a fight. Instead, she got a silence so loud it revealed secrets she never saw coming. Let's begin.
The silence in the Back Bay apartment wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm that refuses to break. Charlotte stood by the frosted window, her breath hitching, the echo of her own voice, "Just leave me alone," still bouncing off the high ceilings. She expected William to shout back, to fight for her, to demand to know where she had been really spending her evenings. Instead, she heard the soft, deliberate click of the guest bedroom door closing. No slam, no rage, just a quiet retreat that felt more final than any scream. If stories about the terrifying weight of regret and the deafening sound of a love quietly dying speak to you, stay with me. This isn't a story about a fight. It's about the exit you never saw coming. The radiator in the corner of the living room hissed, a sharp, mechanical sound that cut through the thick silence of the Boston brownstone. Outside, the wind whipped snow against the bay windows, but inside, the temperature felt even colder. Charlotte Hayes stood in the center of the Persian rug, her chest heaving, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. The words she had just screamed, "God, just leave me alone, William. Just stop," seemed to hang in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate. She waited for the retaliation. She waited for William to throw his book down, to raise his voice, to ask her the question she had been dreading for months. Where were you tonight? She had the lie ready on her tongue. A late meeting at the publishing house, a crisis with a manuscript, a drink with Emily. The lies were becoming easier, smoother, like stones polished by a river. But William didn't shout. He sat in his leather armchair, the one near the fireplace where the embers were dying out. He looked at her, his eyes dark and unreadable behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He placed his book, The Architecture of Silence, gently on the side table. He didn't slam it. He didn't toss it. He aligned it perfectly with the edge of the coaster. "Is that what you want, Charlotte?" he asked. His voice was low, devoid of the anger she was desperate to provoke. Anger would be easy. Anger would justify her own resentment. Anger would make him the villain and her the victim of a volatile marriage. "Yes," she breathed out, her voice trembling slightly. She turned away, unable to bear the steadiness of his gaze. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, smelling the faint, lingering scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch on her scarf. Julian's scent. I can't breathe in here sometimes. You're always hovering, always waiting. It's suffocating." It was a cruel thing to say to a man who had waited up for her with a pot of chamomile tea, now cold on the tray. William stood up. The creak of the leather chair sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Charlotte flinched, bracing herself. "I didn't realize my concern was a cage," William said. He walked past her towards the hallway. He didn't try to touch her arm. He didn't try to kiss her cheek. He moved with a strange, fluid detachment, like a ghost haunting his own house. I won't ask you about your meeting, Charlotte. And I won't ask you why you smell like a cigar bar when Hartwell Publishing has been a smoke-free zone for 10 years. Charlotte's heart hammered against her ribs. She spun around. William, He held up a hand. Not aggressively, but with a weary finality. You asked to be left alone, he said, his hand resting on the brass doorknob of the guest bedroom. I'm going to respect that. Tonight. And for as long as you need. He opened the door. Good night, Charlotte. The door clicked shut. It was the softest sound she had ever heard, yet it vibrated through the floorboards and up her spine. Charlotte stood alone in the living room. The grand clock on the mantel ticked. Tock, 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 marking the seconds of her victory. She had won. He was leaving her alone. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below, where the street lamps created halos in the falling snow. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Julian. Already missing you. The night is too long without your fire. She looked at the screen, then back at the closed guest room door. A strange knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She had expected a fight. She had prepared for a war. She didn't know how to handle a surrender that felt so much like an ambush. From behind the closed door, she heard a sound she wasn't meant to hear. The distinctive metallic zip of a suitcase being opened. The morning light filtering through the bay windows of the brownstone usually brought warmth, casting long golden rectangles across the oak floors. Today, the light seemed thin, pale, and utterly devoid of heat. Charlotte woke up in the master bedroom, the expanse of the king-sized mattress stretching out beside her like a white desert. The sheets on William's side were pristine, unwrinkled, cold to the touch. For 7 years, she had woken up to the sound of his breathing or the smell of the coffee he brewed, a dark, rich roast that he imported specifically because she liked the hazelnut undertones. Today, there was only silence. She walked down to the kitchen, wrapping her silk robe tight around her waist. She expected to find him at the granite island, perhaps sulking, perhaps waiting with an apology or a demand for one. Instead, the kitchen was spotless. A single mug sat in the drying rack. The coffee pot was cold and empty. He had made coffee only for himself. A petty detail, Charlotte thought as she forcefully shoved a pod into the espresso machine. It was petty, and yet it stung more than the argument the night before. William wasn't a petty man. He was a man of service, of quiet gestures. Withdrawing those gestures felt like a structural wall had been removed from their house. The roof hadn't collapsed yet, but the groan of the timber was audible. She found a note on the counter. Her heart jumped. Was this the confrontation? Pest control coming at 10 a.m. Don't let the cat out. No love, William. No have a good day. Just logistics. The handwriting was neat, precise, and devastatingly impersonal. Fine, she whispered to the empty room, tossing the note into the recycling bin. Be that way. She dressed with extra care that morning, choosing a crimson blouse that William always said was too bold for the office, but that Julian claimed made her look like a modern muse. If William wasn't going to look at her, she would go where she was seen. At Hartwell Publishing, the air was buzzing with the chaos of the upcoming fall catalog. Julian St. James was lounging in her office when she arrived, his legs crossed, a manuscript balanced on his knee. He looked up, his smile crooked and knowing. Rough night in suburbia? He asked, his voice a low purr. We live in Back Bay, Julian. She corrected automatically, closing the door behind her. And yes, I told him to leave me alone. Julian raised an eyebrow, impressed. And did the good architect crumble? He withdrew, Charlotte said, sinking into her chair. She didn't mention the guest room. She didn't mention the zipper sound. Saying it out loud would give it weight. He's playing some sort of game, the silent treatment. Ah, the weapon of the weak, Julian scoffed, standing up and walking over to her desk. He leaned in, smelling of tobacco and ink. Let him sulk. It gives us more time to discuss the editing process. His fingers brushed against hers, electric and illicit. Lunch at the Sapphire Lounge? I need your eyes on Chapter 4. The protagonist finally realizes his wife never understood his genius. Charlotte smiled, the validation washing over her like a warm bath. This was what she needed. Passion. Intellectual fire. Not the man who left notes about pest control. But when she returned home that evening, the house was dark. Usually, William left, the hallway lamp on, a beacon guiding her home. Tonight, she had to fumble for the switch. She found him in the dining room, but he wasn't eating. He was sitting at the table with a laptop and a stack of documents. He looked up as she entered, his face composed, his glasses reflecting the overhead light. "You're late," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, like commenting on the weather. "I had a deadline," she lied, the taste of the expensive Pinot Noir she'd shared with Julian still on her tongue. "Did you eat?" "Hours ago," William replied, turning his attention back to the screen. "I assumed you would be occupied." Charlotte walked closer, trying to see what was on his screen, but he casually minimized the window. It wasn't a jerky, guilty motion. It was smooth, practiced. "Are you still sleeping in the guest room?" she asked, hatred for the wobble in her voice rising in her throat. William looked at her then, really looked at her. His eyes were dry, clear, and terrifyingly calm. "You asked for space, Charlotte. I am giving you exactly what you asked for. Why does that upset you?" "It doesn't," she snapped, turning on her heel. "It's peaceful." "Good," he said, his attention already back on the paperwork. "Then we are both getting what we want." She marched up the stairs, her heels clicking loudly on the wood. She went into the master bedroom and slammed the door, waiting for the footsteps that would follow, waiting for him to come up and ask what was wrong. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then an hour. The only sound from downstairs was the faint, rhythmic tapping of keys on a laptop. He wasn't coming. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing against her ears. She thought about the zipper sound again. She stood up and walked to the closet. His side was still full of suits. His shoes were still in the rack. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Paranoid, she told herself. He's just sulking. But as she lay in the cold bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man downstairs wasn't sulking. He was working. And whatever he was building or dismantling, he was doing it with the same terrifying precision he applied to his skyscrapers.
Hold on. Let me pause here for a moment. Did you notice the shift? William didn't yell, and he didn't slam doors. He just stopped making her coffee. That small detail is actually terrifying. When a partner stops doing the little things, they aren't trying to punish you like a child. They are emotionally checking out. He's shifting from a husband to just a roommate. Have you ever felt someone withdraw like this before?
3 days later, Charlotte found herself sitting in a velvet booth at the Sapphire Lounge, the candlelight dancing off the rim of her wine glass. Across from her, Julian was dissecting the literary merits of a rival author, his hands moving expressively, his voice a hypnotic baritone that usually thrilled her. But tonight, Charlotte's gaze kept drifting to her phone, face down on the table. "You're distracted," Julian noted, stopping mid-sentence. He reached across the table, his fingers grazing her wrist. The touch was deliberate, possessing. Is it the architect, still playing his little game of silence? Charlotte flinched slightly at the tone. "It's not a game, Julian. It's strange. He's polite. He's functional, but he's not there." Julian laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that grated against the jazz music playing softly in the background. "Darling, was he ever really there? William is a man of straight lines and blueprints. He builds structures to contain things. He doesn't understand people like us, people who need chaos, who need to burn." He leaned closer, his eyes dark with intent. "He's simple, Charlotte. Reliable, sure, but painfully simple." Something in Charlotte's chest tightened, a defensive reflex she hadn't expected. "He's not simple," she said, pulling her hand back. "He's brilliant in his own way. He designed the wing of the art museum you love so much." Julian waved a hand dismissively. "Bricks and mortar. I'm talking about soul. You're starving, Charlotte. I can see it. Stop feeling guilty for eating when you're hungry." He leaned in to kiss her, a bold move in a public place. It was the moment she had fantasized about for weeks. But as his face neared, hers, all she could think of was the cold espresso machine and the single mug in the drying rack. She turned her head at the last second, letting his lips brush her cheek. "I have to go," she whispered, grabbing her purse. "I can't do this tonight." She left Julian looking baffled and annoyed in the candlelight. The drive back to Back Bay was a blur of guilt and confusion. She wanted to go home. She wanted to walk through the door and find William reading in his chair. She wanted to start a fight, just to hear his voice raise, just to see him lose control because he cared. But when she unlocked the heavy oak door of the brownstone, the house greeted her with absolute darkness. "William," she called out, flipping the hallway switch. Silence. She checked the kitchen. Pristine. The living room. Empty. She ran up the stairs, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The master bedroom was empty. She hesitated, then knocked on the guest room door. "William?" She pushed the door, open. The bed was made, perfectly tight corners, military precision. The room was uninhabited. She checked the closet in the hallway where they kept their coats. His favorite trench coat was gone. His boots were missing. It was 10:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. William Carter, the man who was in bed by 10:30 every weeknight for 7 years, the man whose schedule was as predictable as the tides, was not home. Charlotte stood in the hallway, her phone in her hand. Her thumb hovered over his name. "Where are you?" She typed the message. Then she deleted it. "You asked to be left alone." His voice echoed in her memory. If she asked him where he was, she would be admitting that she noticed his absence. She would be admitting that she cared. And worse, she would be breaking the rules of the new reality she had set in motion. She walked into the living room and sat on the sofa, still in her coat. The house felt different tonight. It didn't feel like a home where someone was just out for the evening. It felt like a staging property. Beautiful, staged, and completely devoid of life. At 11:30 p.m., the front door clicked open. Charlotte stiffened, pretending to read a magazine she had grabbed from the coffee table. She heard his footsteps, measured, calm. He walked into the living room, smelling of night air and something else. Not perfume, not alcohol. He smelled of cold wind and old paper. He saw her sitting there. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look guilty. "Good evening," he said, unbuttoning his coat. "You're late," Charlotte said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. William paused. He looked at the grandfather clock, then back at her. "I wasn't aware I had a curfew. I was just worried," she lied. "Don't be," he said, turning toward the stairs. "I was just taking care of some administrative matters." "At midnight?" He stopped on the bottom step and looked back at her. His expression was mild, almost pitying. "Time is relative when you're restructuring your life, Charlotte." He walked up the stairs, his footsteps fading into the silence of the second floor. Charlotte sat alone in the pool of lamplight, realizing with a dawn of horror that while she was out playing at romance, William was doing something far more dangerous. He was moving on. Wednesday brought a heavy gray rain that washed the streets of Back Bay in a sheen of oil and grit. William had left the house before Charlotte woke up. No note this time. Just the absence of his car in the garage and the lingering smell of his shaving cream in the bathroom, a scent that used to mean comfort, but now smelled like a stranger's cologne. Charlotte left work early. She told Emily she had a migraine, but the truth was a gnawing anxiety that sat in her stomach like a stone. Julian had texted her 3 times, each message more suggestive than the last, but she hadn't replied. William's comment about restructuring his life had planted a seed of paranoia that refused to stop growing. The brownstone was silent when she entered. It was 3 p.m. She hung her coat and stood in the hallway, staring at the closed double doors of William's study. In 7 years of marriage, she rarely went in there. It was his sanctuary, a room of drafts, blueprints, and the smell of cedar shavings. She respected his privacy, just as he had always respected hers. But the rules had changed. Or rather, she had broken them, and now she needed to know if he was breaking them too. "If he's seeing someone," she thought, her hand trembling as she reached for the brass handle, "then I'm not the only one. If he's guilty, I'm free." She pushed the door open. The room was meticulously organized. Rolls of blueprints were categorized by year in the corner bins. His drafting table was angled toward the window, clean except for a single mechanical pencil. It was the desk of a man with nothing to hide. Charlotte began to search. She started with the wastebasket. Empty. She checked the bookshelf, pulling out volumes to see if anything was hidden behind them. Nothing. She felt a flush of shame creeping up her neck. She was violating him, hunting for dirt in a pristine room. She sat in his leather chair, the leather groaning under her weight. She opened the top drawer. Stationery, stamps, a checkbook. She opened the bottom drawer. It was locked. She knew where the key was, under the potted fern on the windowsill. A cliché, but William was a creature of habit. She retrieved the small silver key and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a satisfying click. Inside, there was a single thick manila folder labeled in William's precise block lettering. Transition. Charlotte's breath hitched. She pulled it out, her fingers brushing against the stiff paper. Transition to what? A new life? A new woman? She opened the file. The first page was a spreadsheet. Numbers. Lots of them. Asset liquidation projection. Joint account separation protocol. Tax implications of title transfer. She frowned, flipping the page. There were printouts of apartment listings. Small, efficient studios in the Seaport district, modern, sterile, and half the size of their guest room. There were emails printed out between William and a headhunter, about a potential partnership in Chicago. Charlotte let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. Work. It was just work. Transition didn't mean a divorce. It meant a career pivot. She knew he had been frustrated with the bureaucratic nature of his firm lately. He had complained months ago about wanting to downsize, to focus on purer architecture. The studio apartments were probably investment properties or a temporary crash pad if he took the job in Chicago. He wasn't leaving her. He was thinking of leaving his job. The realization washed over her, cleansing the guilt. His distance, his late nights, the administrative matters. It was all stress. He was going through a mid-career crisis, silently carrying the burden of a major professional shift. She wasn't losing him to another woman. She wasn't losing him at all. He was just a stressed man trying to figure out his next move. And if he was distracted by his career, that gave her a pass. It meant his silence wasn't a judgment on her infidelity. It was a symptom of his own preoccupation. Charlotte closed the folder and carefully placed it back in the drawer. She locked it and returned the key to its spot under the fern. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. A smile touched her lips for the first time in days. She felt lighter, absolved. William was just busy. He was still her William, dependable, ambitious, and ultimately hers to keep or discard. She took her phone out and finally replied to Julian. "Dinner tonight? I need a distraction." She walked out of the study, closing the door on the secrets she thought she understood. She didn't notice that under the asset liquidation spreadsheet, there was a smaller document she had missed. A single page titled, "Draft of Settlement Agreement, Irreconcilable Differences." The Hartwell Publishing annual gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, a venue dripping with crystal chandeliers and the heavy scent of expensive lilies. It was a night of performance, where editors, authors, and investors pretended to like each other over glasses of lukewarm champagne. Charlotte wore a backless emerald gown that clung to her frame, a statement piece intended to project confidence. Beside her, William was the picture of the ideal spouse. In his bespoke tuxedo, he looked sharp, distinguished, and utterly impenetrable. He held her arm not with possession, but with the polite guidance of a museum curator handling a fragile exhibit. "Smile," William murmured as a photographer's flash blinded them. "The board is watching." "I am smiling," Charlotte whispered back through gritted teeth. She was terrified. Julian was here. He was the star author of the season, the center of attention. She had spent the last hour maneuvering William to the opposite side of the room, terrified of the combustion that would occur if matter and antimatter collided. But in a room this crowded, gravity was inevitable. "Charlotte!" The voice boomed over the murmur of the crowd. She froze. Julian St. James approached them, a glass of scotch in hand, looking disheveled in a way that was meant to be artistic, but tonight just looked messy compared to William's tailored precision. "And this must be the famous William," Julian said, stepping into their personal space. He didn't offer a hand immediately. He looked William up and down with a smirk that bordered on insolence. "I've heard silence about you." Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, ready to intervene, to deflect, to drag William away before he snapped. "William," she started, her voice high and brittle. "This is Julian St. James, one of our—" "I know who he is," William interrupted softly. He extended his hand. His movement was slow, deliberate. "I read your latest novel, Mr. St. James, The Art of Burning." Julian blinked, surprised. He took William's hand. The shake was firm, brief, and dismissing. Did you? I assumed architecture was the only art you consumed. Structural integrity and all that. Structure is necessary, William said, his voice even, cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. Without it, things don't just burn. They collapse. There's a difference between a fire that warms a house and arson that destroys it. Your characters seem to confuse the two. The air between them crackled. Charlotte looked from one man to the other. Julian's smirk faltered. He had expected a dull, cuckolded husband he could intellectually bully. He hadn't expected to be analyzed. Passion is messy, William, Julian countered, stepping closer, his eyes flicking to Charlotte possessively. It destroys structures. That's the point. William looked at Charlotte then. For a second, his mask slipped, revealing a depth of sadness so profound it made her knees weak. But just as quickly, the wall went back up. Yes, William said, turning back to Julian with a terrifyingly polite smile. It certainly does. Enjoy your evening, Mr. St. James. I believe your public is waiting. William placed a hand on the small of Charlotte's back. No pressure, just a signal, and guided her away. He didn't look back. He didn't squeeze her arm in anger. He didn't hiss an accusation in her ear. They walked out onto the balcony for fresh air. The city lights of Boston sprawled below them. He knows, Charlotte thought, panic rising in her chest. He has to know. She looked at William's profile. He was lighting a cigarette, something he hadn't done since college. William? She asked tentatively. He exhaled a plume of smoke into the cold night air. He's smaller than I imagined, William said, not looking at her. Who? St. James. William turned to her, his eyes devoid of jealousy. I thought he would be more intelligent, more substantial. I suppose I wanted to believe you were risking everything for something remarkable. He took another drag, his gaze drifting back to the skyline. But he's just a man who likes the sound of his own voice. Charlotte felt a flush of humiliation hotter than any anger. William wasn't jealous. He was disappointed. Not in her betrayal, but in her taste. Let's go home, William said, dropping the half-finished cigarette and crushing it under his polished shoe. I've seen enough. He walked back inside, leaving Charlotte alone on the balcony. She looked through the glass doors at the party inside, the glass house she had built. She saw Julian laughing with a group of young interns, looking distinctively average, and she saw William moving through the crowd with a dignity that made everyone else look like children. For the first time, the thrill of the affair vanished, replaced by a cold, sinking realization. She was trading a diamond for a piece of broken glass, and the diamond didn't even care enough to be angry about it. The day after the gala, the sky over Boston was the color of a bruised plum. A storm was coming, a proper blizzard this time. Julian had called her at lunch, his voice sharp with wounded pride. He humiliated me, Charlotte, the way he looked at us, like we were insects. You have to end it, tonight. Tell him you're leaving. Don't let him hold that moral high ground. Charlotte agreed. The memory of William's disappointed gaze on the balcony burned her skin. She couldn't live in this limbo anymore. She would go home, sit him down, and tell him the truth. She would ask for a separation. She would take control. She arrived at the brownstone at 4 p.m. William's car was gone. Perfect. She would have time to prepare, to gather her thoughts, maybe even pack a bag to show him she was serious. She walked into the living room, intending to wait. but her eyes were drawn to the study door. It was slightly ajar. A strange compulsion pulled her toward it. She pushed the door open. The room was even emptier than before. The books were gone from the shelves. The personal photos were missing. The transition file was sitting squarely in the center of the mahogany desk, no longer locked in the drawer. Beside it lay a leather-bound notebook she recognized, William's daily journal. Why is this out? She wondered. Did he forget? She walked around the desk and sat in his chair. It felt cold. She opened the file again, flipping past the financial spreadsheets she had dismissed earlier as work-related. She reached the document at the bottom, the one she had missed. It wasn't a job offer. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words swam before her eyes. The date on the draft was from 6 months ago. Her hands shaking, she grabbed the leather journal. William wrote in it every night. She had always assumed it was notes on architecture, sketches of facades and columns. She opened it to a page bookmarked with a blue ribbon. The date was June 12th. I saw them today, at the cafe near the public garden. She was laughing in a way she hasn't laughed with me in years. He touched her hand, and she didn't pull away. I should have walked in. I should have made a scene. But I just stood there, watching my wife become a stranger. I couldn't shatter her happiness, even if it was built on my ruin. Charlotte gasped, a ragged sound in the quiet room. She frantically flipped the pages forward. August 4th. She lies about the late nights now. She says it's the editorial board. I nod. I make her tea. I am becoming an actor in my own life, playing the role of the oblivious fool so she doesn't have to face the guilt. I will wait. Maybe it's a phase. Maybe she'll come back. October 20th. It's not a phase. She looks at me with contempt now. She hates me because my presence reminds her that she is betraying someone good. I have contacted a lawyer. I will draft the papers, but not file them. I will give her the house. I will take the blame. It's the last thing I can build for her. A graceful exit. Tears blurred her vision, hot and stinging. He knew. He had known everything. Every lie, every late night, every stolen touch with Julian. He hadn't been working late. He had been sitting in this room, writing down the slow death of his heart. She turned to the final entry, dated yesterday, the night she screamed at him. November 15th. She asked me to leave her alone. She screamed it with such desperation. I finally realized that my silence wasn't protecting her. It was trapping her. She wants freedom. I have held on for too long, hoping for a miracle that isn't coming. The preparations are complete. I will give her what she asked for. Charlotte dropped the journal as if it were burning her hands. The transition wasn't a career move. It was a transition away from her. The spreadsheets were him calculating how to leave her with enough money so she wouldn't struggle. The apartment listings were for him, tiny places where he would live alone while she kept the brownstone. She hadn't outsmarted him. She hadn't been clever. She had been cruel. And he had absorbed it all with a terrifying, heartbreaking dignity. She looked up at the empty bookshelves. The silence of the house suddenly felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. She heard the front door open downstairs. Charlotte scrambled up, clutching the journal to her chest. She had to stop him. She had to tell him she didn't know, that she hadn't meant it, that Julian was a mistake. She ran out of the study and to the top of the stairs. William was standing in the foyer. He wasn't taking off his coat. He was standing next to 2 large suitcases that were already waiting by the door. He looked up, and their eyes met. There was no anger in his face, just a profound, exhausted acceptance. You found it, he said quietly. Charlotte gripped the banister, her knuckles turning white. The distance between the top of the stairs and the foyer felt like a canyon, widening with every second of silence. You knew, she whispered, her voice cracking. All this time, you knew. William didn't look up at her immediately. He adjusted the handle of the larger suitcase, checking its balance. I suspected for a long time. I knew for certain when you started hiding your phone screen. You never used to do that. Why didn't you stop me? She rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping on the hem of her skirt. She stopped a few feet away from him, terrified to close the gap. Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you fight for me? William finally looked at her. His eyes were tired, rimmed with the redness of sleepless nights, but they were dry. I was fighting, Charlotte, he said softly. I fought by staying. I fought by giving you space to figure out that what you had with him wasn't real. I thought if I was patient, if I was steady, you would come back to yourself. He gave a small, self-deprecating smile. But I realized something last night. You weren't lost. You were just done. No. Charlotte shook her head violently, tears spilling over. No, I'm not done. Julian, he's nothing. It was just a mistake. A stupid, cliché midlife crisis. It meant nothing, William. It meant enough for you to lie to my face every day for 6 months, William said. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of the words hit her like a physical blow. It meant enough for you to look at me with disgust because I wasn't him. I was confused. I felt suffocated. And you asked for a solution, William reminded her. You stood in that living room and told me to leave you alone. You didn't say, give me time. You didn't say, I'm unhappy. You said, leave me alone. He buttoned his coat. The wool was dark gray, shielding him against the storm outside. I am giving you the only thing I have left to give, he continued. I've transferred the deed of the house to your name solely. The accounts are split. You won't have to worry about money. I don't care about the money, Charlotte screamed, grabbing his arm. The fabric was cold. I don't want the house if you're not in it. Please, William, put the bags down. Let's talk. I'll cut him off. I'll do anything. William looked down at her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean into her touch either. He gently covered her hand with his own, uncurled her fingers, and stepped back. It's too late for talk, Charlotte. You fell in love with a fantasy of passion, and you fell out of love with the reality of a marriage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding band. It was a simple platinum band, scratched from years of drafting and site visits. He walked over to the hallway console table, the marble surface where he used to leave his keys every evening. He placed the ring down. Clink. The sound was tiny, microscopic, yet it filled the entire house. I'm not leaving to punish you, he said, picking up his suitcases. I'm leaving because I can't watch you be unhappy anymore, and I can't watch myself disappear trying to fix it. He walked to the heavy oak door. He paused, his hand on the latch. Where will you go? Charlotte sobbed, her pride completely shattered. Chicago, he said, without turning around. The partnership came through. It's a good city for architecture. Lots of strong foundations. He opened the door. The wind howled instantly, blowing snow into the warm foyer, flakes melting on the pristine floor. William, please. Goodbye, Charlotte. He stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him. The click of the lock engaging was solid, final, and absolute. Charlotte stood alone in the foyer. The cold draft from the open door lingered around her ankles. She looked at the ring on the table. It sat there, a perfect circle of metal, reflecting the overhead light. She ran to the door and threw it open, running out onto the stoop in just her blouse. The street was white, blinded by the blizzard. She saw the taillights of a taxi fading into the distance, two red eyes blinking out in the storm. He was gone. The cold eventually forced her inside. Charlotte closed the heavy door, her fingers numb, her blouse damp with melted snow. She leaned her forehead against the wood, listening to the silence of the house. It was a different kind of silence now. Before, it had been a tense silence, charged with unsaid words and withheld resentments. Now, it was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb or a museum after the visitors have gone. The structure remained, beautiful and imposing, but the life inside had been extinguished. Her phone buzzed relentlessly in her pocket, vibrating against her hip like an angry hornet. She pulled it out. Julian St. James. She stared at the name. A week ago, seeing it would have sent a thrill of illicit excitement through her veins. Now it looked like a typo, a mistake. She slid her thumb across the screen to answer. "Did you do it?" Julian's voice was loud, accompanied by the clinking of glass and the murmur of a crowd. He was at a bar. He was celebrating. "I haven't heard from you. I assume the architect took it well? Did he cry? Or did he just calculate the structural load of his tears?" Julian laughed at his own wit. Charlotte held the phone away from her ear. The sound of his laughter was tinny, shallow, and incredibly grating. It sounded like static. "He's gone, Julian," she said, her voice flat. "Perfect," Julian cheered. "I'll come over. We can finally—" "No," Charlotte interrupted. "What?" "Don't come over. Don't call me again." "Charlotte, don't be dramatic. You're upset. It's the adrenaline. You need me to—" "I don't need you," she said, the realization crystallizing in her mind with painful clarity. "I never needed you. I just needed to feel something other than boredom. And I used you to break the only real thing I ever had." "You're hysterical," Julian sneered, his charm dissolving instantly when rejected. "You'll call me in the morning when the loneliness kicks in." "I am lonely," Charlotte admitted, looking at the empty staircase. "But I'd rather be lonely by myself than lonely with you." She ended the call. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she blocked his number. She deleted their message thread, months of witty banter, poetic seduction, and lies. It took 3 seconds to erase what she had destroyed her marriage for. She walked into the living room. It was perfectly staged. The cushions were fluffed. The rugs were aligned. But without William's book on the side table, without the smell of his coffee, without the quiet reassurance of his presence in the periphery, it wasn't a home. It was just real estate. She went to the marble console table in the hallway. The platinum ring was still there. She picked it up. It was cold and heavy. Inside the band, there was an inscription she hadn't looked at in years. To build a life. William had built. She had demolished. She walked to the bay window in the living room, the spot where she had stood nights ago when she screamed those fateful words. The storm outside had turned the world into a white void. The tire tracks of the taxi were already gone, buried under fresh snow. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering not from the cold, but from the terrifying vastness of the freedom she had demanded. She had the house. She had the money. She had her autonomy. No one was hovering. No one was waiting up for her. No one was checking to see if she was okay. She pressed her hand against the freezing glass, watching her own reflection, a ghost in a glass house. Tears finally came, hot and silent, tracking down her cheeks. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. She just stood there, paralyzed by the weight of her own victory. William had listened to her. He had listened to her better than she had ever listened to him. He gave her exactly what she asked for, and in doing so, he had taken everything that mattered. She looked out at the empty, snowy street, the solitude wrapping around her throat like a chokehold. I asked for silence, she whispered to the empty room, her voice breaking into the void. But I didn't know silence could be this loud.
Let's take a breath here. I didn't know silence could be this loud. That line is haunting. Charlotte got exactly what she asked for. She is finally alone. But there is a massive difference between solitude and abandonment. Blocking Julian proves that the affair was just a painkiller. And now the medicine has worn off. Do you think Charlotte deserves a second chance, or is this a lesson she needed to learn the hard way? Sometimes, we mistake peace for boredom, and chaos for passion. Charlotte's story reminds us that a calm exit can be the most powerful statement of all. William didn't leave because he stopped loving her. He left because he loved himself enough not to be an option. If you were Charlotte, would you try to find him, or would you accept the silence you created? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please share it. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of your heart.